Welcome students, this is module 1.3.4 community college, yes, you're in community college, community ecology. In particular, you will recall that the community is all the species of organisms that live in one specific definable environment. We're going to begin our discussion of community ecology by talking about types of species. So types of species. We're going to start that by discussing native species. A native species is a species that naturally originated in or arrived at the particular community or ecosystem where they live. In other words, they arrived by natural dispersal without any help from humans. And if we talk about some native species here in the Southwest, beaver-tailed cactus, the jaguar or El Tigre. Jaguars were found as far north as the Grand Canyon, as far west as Palm Springs. When Europeans first arrived, their range has contracted as a result of hunting by humans. In the upper right here, we have Ocotillo, which is not a cactus; it's in its own family. It's a really unique and beautiful species. And then the javelina, which has been, as the climate has become warmer, the javelina's distribution has moved further north. A second category of species besides native would be non-native. Non-native species are also known by titles such as invasive or alien or exotic species. Exotic makes them sound quite wonderful and desirable, but in fact that's just the opposite. Non-native species are species that have been artificially introduced into a community. In other words, through human agency, they have been introduced to an ecosystem with which they did not co-evolve, and this can cause a number of problems. Some examples here from the Southwest Arizona. The bullfrog is a non-native species. It's native to the Mississippi River drainage, and that's where it belongs, but here it creates a great deal of problems for other amphibians. Tumbleweed, also known as Russian thistle, can cover acres and acres, and it is not a native species. There are no native crayfish in Arizona, and yet we have many that are here. There are no native bass, either largemouth bass or smallmouth bass, in Arizona. Chickens, cattle, fire ants are some examples. These species can be very harmful because they can displace native species. And especially think about a plant that does that. For example, tumbleweed or Russian thistle. If it grows where a native plant would grow, and because it did not co-evolve in this ecosystem, there may not be herbivores that have adapted to use tumbleweed, to feed on tumbleweed, and as a consequence, the whole food chain is disrupted by having this non-native species present. These species, there's nothing wrong inherently with these species, but they do show a certain aggressive tendency when they're introduced to a new place, and they belong in their native ecosystems. And ecologists will often work to eliminate non-native species. Here is a bullfrog, and this is the way an ecologist would often like to look at a bullfrog. I think I'm joking, but that's actually very true. Here are some more non-native species in Arizona. There are no native crayfish. It is illegal to transport a living crayfish in Arizona. Game and Fish will allow you to take as many crayfish as you want. I think on their website, they used to anyway, I haven't checked for a couple of years, they used to have plans to make a crayfish trap. They want people to remove them. They eat the native fishes and amphibians. They're very disruptive. And Russian thistle, it can cover acres and acres, like I said. Let's look at a third example of types of species, and this is a species really an indicator species. This is when we use the presence or absence of a species to tell us something about an ecosystem. Often we use indicator species to indicate healthy ecosystems. I use an analogy here on this slide. I say there that indicator species are like a canary in a coal mine. You may or may not know that it was actually true that coal miners carried canaries in small little cages down into the coal mine with them, and it's because the canary, having a smaller body size, would be more quickly affected by otherwise undetectable pockets of poisonous gas. So if the miner looked over and saw that the canary was squawking or falling over in its cage, the miner would quickly vacate that area. And so the canary was an indicator of a troubled environment for the miners. Some examples of indicator species can be certain species of birds, amphibians, especially frogs, but others as well. Top predators, you will recall that you are to understand why top predators are rare, but also why, if they are present, why that would be an indication of a healthy ecosystem. I know that other indicator species, some species of butterflies have been used. It depends on the ecosystem where you are, where an ecologist is working, what kind of species can be used. This is the Ramsey Canyon leopard frog. Its scientific name is Rana subaquavocalis, and this literally means a frog that sings underwater. As far as I know, it's the only frog that vocalizes underwater. Of course, frogs vocalize or sing to indicate their territories and also to attract mates. And the problem with singing for those kind of roles is that it also attracts predators. By singing underwater, you can still get the benefits and maybe diminish predation. But the Ramsey Canyon leopard frog was extirpated or locally extincted from Ramsey Canyon. It's kind of interesting. And up here on the top of this picture, I ask you a question. I say, did you know that globally amphibians are severely declining? There is a global decline in amphibian populations. Here's a link you can put into your browser and investigate some of the reasons why that might be happening. But certainly climate change, introduced species, or exotic species are two big reasons. Pollution is another one. Let's go ahead and look at a fourth category of types of species, and this would be keystone species. You may or may not know that a keystone is an element in classical architecture. It's illustrated here at the picture on the bottom of this slide. And if you know about physics, you'll know that all the forces of these various bricks are pointing into that keystone. If you pull that keystone out, that arch collapses. And that's the importance that keystone species have. These are species that can shape the community structure by affecting the types and numbers of other species. And that is, they have an inordinate importance. They have an importance far greater than their numbers because of the key ecological roles that they play. And here are some examples. Many species are critical, and we used to joke that all species are keystone species. You can certainly make an argument to that effect, but certainly some species are more important than others, and these are the ones that are more properly designated as keystone species. So let us look at some of the species that could be designated as keystone species. Here I have honeybees, which are, of course, pollinators, and pollination allows plants to reproduce, and plants are the producers. Therefore, pollinators can be very important. Here we have a distinctly southwest pollinator, and this is one of the large nectar-feeding bats, and it's feeding on the state flower of Arizona, the saguaro blossom. Certainly, because of its role as a pollinator, it can be a keystone species. Predators can be keystone species. Here we see a wolf, and wolves, by shaping the herbivore populations, they exert a top-down pressure, and thereby they shape the ecosystems in which they live. And over on the bottom right here, we see some beavers, and beavers are keystone species by virtue of being ecosystem engineers. They actually change the abiotic aspects of an ecosystem, of course, by damming waterways and creating large areas of still water. And the beaver, of course, uses this water to float logs to its lodge and to escape from predators. So it changes the environment in a way that not only makes it more useful for itself, but it also can allow other species to occupy an area that otherwise would be unable to do that. So they are also keystone species. One more example is the Mexican jay, or also known as the gray-breasted jay. These are jays that live in the southwest where there are oak trees. And these birds are closely associated with oak trees. They live in family groups. And what Mexican jays do is they cache or hide acorns to eat later when the oak trees are not producing acorns. By doing so, they plant acorns and keep the oak forest from just going downhill, because acorns are heavy seeds, and they would roll downhill and all the oak trees would be downhill, but the jays fly uphill and hide them, and they maintain the oak forests of the southwest, and that's a pretty important function. And this concludes our introduction to community ecology, in particular talking about different types of species.